All year the flaxstem festered in the heart of the townland, green and heavy-headed. Flax had rotted there, weighed down by huge sods. Daily it sweltered in the punishing sun. Bubbles gargled delicately. Blue bottles wove a strong gauze of sound around the smell. There were dragonflies, spotted butterflies, but best of all was the warm, thick slobber of frog spawn that grew like clotted water in the shades of the banks. Here, every spring, I would fill jam-pot-fulls of the jellied specks to range on windowsills at home, on shelves at school, and wait and watch until the fattening dots burst into nimble swimming tadpoles. Miss Wall would tell us how the daddy frog was called a bullfrog, and how he croaked, and how the mammy frog laid hundreds of little eggs, and this was frog spawn. You could tell the weather by frogs too, for they were yellow in sun and brown in rain. Then one hot day, when fields were rank with cow dung in the grass, the angry frogs invaded the flax dam. I ducked through hedges to a coarse croaking that I had not heard before. The air was thick with a bass chorus. Right down the dam, gross-bellied frogs were cocked on sods. Their loose necks pulsed like sails. Some hopped. The slap and plop were obscene threats. Some sat poised like mud grenades, their blunt heads farting. I sickened, turned and ran. The great slime kings were gathered there for vengeance, and I knew that if I dipped my hand, the spawn would clutch it. The poem starts with a description of the flax dam. It's in the heart of the town, and in the summer heat, the flax is rotting, attracting all sorts of insects. The child seemed fascinated by this place where he finds flies, bluebottles, dragonflies, butterflies, all sorts of creatures, and it's nature that seems alive in this description at the beginning of the poem. What particularly interests him, though, is spring, when the frog spawn appears, and this description of it as warm, thick slobber like clotted water vividly describes the gelatinous nature of frog spawn and the fascination that this child has with it. The poem continues, focusing in on the detail of the frog spawn, which the child collects and puts in jam pots and sits on windowsills and watches it change. We also learn that at school the child learns more about the reproduction of frogs, and that the daddy frog is called the bullfrog and the mammy frog lays hundreds of little eggs. And again we see this childhood fascination for nature and for the frog spawn itself. We also know the child is fascinated by the frogs because there's an added detail that the frogs change in the weather too, yellow in sun and brown in rain. So here again, as this stanza continues, shows us how fascinated the child is, captivated by the frog spawn and by nature itself. In the second stanza, there is a change in tone, and there is a change. It's a hot summer's day and the child has returned to the flax dam, but now it has been invaded by angry frogs. The language has changed and it has a more military tone. We have words like invaded, grenade, cocked, which are all associated with war and soldiers. The frogs seem angry, the child seems afraid. The sound of the frogs is aggressive and takes over the flax dam. But also, the child is now revolted by the frogs. They are described as gross-bellied and loose necks pulse like sails. There's a revulsion here about the frogs. The fascination, the captivation that the child once had has been lost. But also there is a threat. The slap and plop were obscene threats. It seems frightening now, and it's as though the frogs want to attack the child, or that's at least how he feels. And the guilt that he feels for having taken the frog spawn many years ago as a child and watching it change into tadpoles is coming back to haunt him. He describes the frogs as great slime kings gathered there for vengeance, and that's what he believes, that the frogs want to get their own back on the child for taking the frog spawn all those years ago. So the tone in the second part of the poem, the second stanza, is more threatening, it's revulsion, and there we've got the loss of interest and the death of this naturalist. The naturalist, a love of nature, has died by the end of the poem. He no longer is interested or fascinated by nature in the way that he was at the beginning of the poem.